Hello everyone, my name is Jane Nicholson-Bliss. I'm the Event Manager for the Institute of Leadership and Management. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce Nicholas Lynch, a consultant working with the Institute of Leadership and Management. Nicholas, over to you.
Thanks, Jane, and welcome everyone to this webinar. My role today is really just to take those questions that you're going to submit and then throw them back to our speaker today. So with no more ado, I'll just introduce Matt Offord. Matt is a former naval officer who now works in leadership and professional development. Matt's naval career included the Navy's prestigious Flag Officer Sea Training Organisation, and he was subsequently selected for a research fellowship at the University of Oxford. Matt's presented his research on subjects as diverse as the value of prestige in social networks, leadership in the information age, and sport and team cohesion. Matt's a fellow of the Institute of Leadership and Management. He holds an MBA in Leadership Studies and a PhD from Durham University Business School. So therefore, Matt, I think, is very well placed to talk to us today about ownership, taking the initiative. Matt, can I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you very much, Nicholas, for that introduction. So we're going to talk about taking the initiative, and I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then there'll be a chance for questions afterwards. So we start off, as we have done with all of these webinars on a Wednesday, with this model of leadership, which you can find on the Institute of Leadership and Management's website. The Institute are quite keen to point out that this is not a framework, but actually a dynamic model. You can go on this on your website, on the Institute website rather, and you can use it for your own personal development or in your company as you see fit. So we're going to zoom in on ownership, and then we're going to zoom in further. We can see there are a bunch of topics there under ownership, and then we're going to finally alight on taking initiative, which will be the subject of this discussion today. So the first point I think to make is that by showing confidence, leaders can really start to own the different opportunities that are out there. And this is the key role for a leader, which is basically to reduce uncertainty among their teams. So when we look at taking initiative itself, we're looking at recognizing opportunities, confidence, and also different approaches. And I'll talk a little bit about these now. First of all, in terms of recognizing opportunities, in leadership studies, and also when we look at strategy as well, strategic studies in terms of strategy making, academics talk about the recognizing opportunities as boundary spanning, and they point out that leaders do a lot of this boundary spanning, which is kind of scanning the horizon, constantly looking for both threats and opportunities. And again, this is a key role that leaders have in reducing uncertainty. So spotting those opportunities is one thing, but also it's having the confidence to basically take those opportunities. And I'd just like to give an example from my naval career. When I was working in a port which had nuclear submarines in it, was a big nuclear submarine base, I worked for a guy called Ken, and he was a great leader and also a mentor for me. And one of the things that illustrates his sort of leadership was one day a Greenpeace vessel stormed into our control waters. This was in 2007, and it was the MV Arctic Sunrise. And normally the Navy's approach and the MOD's approach to these things is to try and keep them they basically isolate themselves from them and try not to interrupt them, because essentially they have a right to free speech. But in this case, they were starting to become very unpredictable and very dangerous. So Ken took the unusual step of contacting the Minister of Armed Forces to get permission to arrest and seize the ship. And no one really thought that he would be able to do this, because it was a very, very tricky maritime operation. But Ken had the confidence in his people and confidence in his own decision to go ahead with that. And that ship was detained. The ship's crew were arrested, and it was not the result that they were expecting that day. They didn't expect to be arrested. They thought they would be able to do their thing, break into nuclear submarines and try and create all sorts of mayhem. But Ken recognized that he could do something different to the norm, and also had the confidence to do it. And that was a big difference in Ken's style of leadership. And then finally, on approaches, again, if you, the model that we just looked at and we sort of zoomed through all of those different nodes, you can do the same thing on the Institute of Leadership and Management's website. And when you get to taking initiative, there's a report there and it talks about approaches, and I'd recommend that you take a look at this. But it talks about different approaches like brainstorming and things like that. But I would add to that, there's also the approach that you take in terms of your attitude, which could be a proactive or a reactive approach. So this slide is about opportunities and ideas, and I think the key point here is that it's opportunities and ideas. I'm the sort of person who likes to have lots of ideas. I spend a lot of time thinking about different ideas. So I have this bag of ideas, if you like, and the bag just seems to get bigger and bigger. But you also need to find the opportunities in which to take action. So it's not just about having ideas, it's also being able to spot those opportunities to execute those ideas. So how do we recognize opportunities? I always find lists like this a little bit daunting because they basically describe someone who is good at whatever the list is about. In this case, it's about recognizing opportunities. And it's easy to think, well, I'm not good at that, so, you know, what can I do about it? So the question is how do I become someone who does all of these things on the list? The good news is that in this, as much as anything else in leadership development, it's not about what you're born with. It's about how you develop as a person and how you form good habits. And this is one of them. So the top thing on the list, which is continuous curiosity, or you might say vigilance, this is the key to all of the other things. If you take time in your day, even if it's 5 minutes, to sit down with a notebook and write down all of the opportunities and threats that you can think of in your area, then you'll find that all these other things will start to kick in as well. You'll find that you're more naturally paying attention to those sort of things because you've already been thinking about it and your mind is already working on that issue. And similarly, you'll be able to ask good questions, and boundary spanning, as I said before, will become just a habit. And we're looking next slide about how people make quick decisions, but I'll just sort of say at the moment that a lot of those decisions are made beforehand by using continuous curiosity, by just taking that 5 minutes to write down what the issues are. And then this final point, which is a really good one for me at the moment, something that I'm focusing on, a lot of coaching and leadership focuses on optimism, quite rightly, but that can become delusional. So it has to be realistic optimism. So what will the opportunities be? Well, this is just a small cluster of different things that you could do with your business or with your project. To be honest, you could think of countless other things to add to that, but this is just an example of some of the things you could be looking at. Edward de Bono devised these thinking hats in 1985. It's classic kind of self-help stuff, and I think it's really useful to help people look at problems in a different way. So de Bono suggested that when we look at any one problem, we should look at them in these 6 different ways. And again, it's a sort of classic whiteboard sort of thing. You can write your problem in the middle, and then you can write the answers to all of the questions which are posed by the different hats around there. It's a way of sort of shortcutting the process, which is called parallel processing. And parallel processing is when you can basically think about 2 or 3 or 4 different things at the same time. When I was in the submarine service, I was told that submarine commanders who had to pass the perisher course, which allowed them to become the captain of a submarine, it was a very, very tough course. They had to be able to parallel process 7 different situations at one time. And the ability to do that gives you a huge advantage. And this is a way of sort of shortcutting that by just doing it on a whiteboard and looking at 6 different strands of a problem. Again, it just helps you to see that problem in a much more complicated and nuanced way, rather than just a simple way and potentially getting the wrong end of the stick and making the wrong decision. So it wouldn't be a proper discussion of initiative if we didn't try to define it. So this definition, which was written in an academic journal in 2001, is not a recent quote, but it is a very good one, and I don't think there's anything better out there at the moment. What I like about it in particular is it discusses the proactive approach, which we spoke about earlier, but also something which I think is very often missed out, which is persistence. It's not just about having good ideas and recognizing opportunities. Actually, it's about seeing them through too. So another list of things that we may or may not be good at. But once again, this would really start from that habit forming exercise of taking 5 minutes to write down all of the opportunities. And I would probably add threats to that too. And then about essentially doing something about it. It's not always easy to be confident, but it does help if you've had an idea and you've thought about it beforehand. And as I said in that slide, the ability to think about things beforehand can help you to make quick and accurate judgments at the time. And it will look as if you've made that decision there and then, but in fact, it's due to some earlier thought that you've had. There's a really good quote in the Japanese Bushido book called the Hagakure, which is their sort of samurai manual, and it says, "Take grave decisions lightly." In other words, make it look as if when you make a really important decision that it was just easy, and that's because you've been thinking about it a long time before anybody else, and therefore when you come to the decision, it's comparatively straightforward. So leadership and initiative, how are those two things connected? Well, as I said before, one of the functions of leadership, and we wouldn't have leaders if they didn't serve a purpose other than just being leaders, is to reduce uncertainty. So that means taking the initiative, essentially. So by behaving in the ways shown there in the list, you can start to take the initiative and also appear as a confident and assertive leader. Once again, being that sort of person is essentially a habit and something that you've probably already been working on for many years and can continue to work upon. And then I think this slide is also really important too, because the ability to take the initiative is not a secret superpower that you can keep all to yourself. No matter how many extra advantages you may have by formulating these habits, just think how much better it will be for your business, your organization, if everybody is doing the same. That's going to increase that capacity exponentially. So how do you do that? Well, obviously, you need to delegate and empower people to make their own decisions, to see those opportunities themselves, and have the framework whereby they can actually do that without and feel psychologically safe to do so without feeling that the boss is going to come down heavy on them because they've taken the initiative. It's not one of those situations where they say, you know, we've paid you to do your job and not to think. You have to encourage people to think and not punish them when they make mistakes, because of course they will do. So that might just be providing opportunities for them to make those decisions, or you may have to gradually increase the degree of difficulty, what we call scaffold learning, as we go along, building them up as we go along. So we spoke a little bit about how you actually become better at this, and I said that it's all down to habits, and that's true. But you probably need to start somewhere, though, and it's a good idea to sit down once again with a whiteboard or a notepad and just make an assessment of your strengths. There's been a lot of talk just lately about not even talking about weaknesses, and there was a webinar a couple of weeks ago by René Carriol about the spike method, where he spoke about forget your weaknesses, just focus on your strengths. And I think this is, you know, good advice, because when you're working on something that you're weak at, you get this sort of law of diminishing returns, so that you're putting in a lot of effort for a smaller change. That said, I did say before that you have to be realistic in your optimism, and self-awareness is very, very important. So when it comes to negative self-talk, as it says here, that sort of little voice in your head that says you can't do this, it's important to understand, and indeed for any external criticism, which bits of that you can take and use and which are good, and which bits you simply ignore. So you have to be realistic and self-aware. But again, all of these things are habits, and it can start by just writing down all of your strengths, opportunities and weaknesses, and matching those strengths with weaknesses. With opportunities. I do beg your pardon. Okay, so in terms of confidence, it's difficult just to be confident. You don't get out of bed one morning and say, right, I'm going to be confident, if you're typically somebody who suffers with low confidence. As I've said before, it's really a habit that you need to sort of work your way into. And by being assertive, and this is something I found when I left the Navy, because in the Navy, you have a lot of your decisions are kind of approved by somebody else. So when you leave the Navy, you have to get used to making those decisions yourself and owning them. And I just sort of started off by making small decisions and stepping forward and saying, yeah, I'm the expert who's made this decision, and just seeing how that goes. And of course, you do get criticism and things do go wrong, but it's a case of continuing onwards. And that's really the difference between those two different sides to the slide. And as you build confidence, you find that you can deal with criticism in a much better way, not by inoculating yourself against it or by ignoring it completely. It's all about taking the good bits and working with that, but not letting it get you down at the same time. And then this is a list of things which I didn't find any difficulty in identifying some habits that I'm into, and certainly procrastination is a big one. So self-sabotaging behavior, this is where your inner voice is telling you that you can't do something and puts all sorts of disruptive things in the way. Like before you start that job, you just maybe need to check your emails or perhaps check on social media and this sort of thing. And so you become, you procrastinate. So I think the thing is just to be aware that those behaviors, whatever they are for you, that is your inner voice. It's only you that's trying to stop yourself from moving forward. One of the things I do with the procrastination thing is to go out for a decent walk. And I think if I'm going to start a project at the beginning, I'll go out for a walk and think about it, so that I've got so many ideas by the time I get back to my desk that I'm sort of really geared up to start writing. And I find that overcomes it. So you can also find these sort of managing tools as well that you can use. But the key thing, I think, is to understand and look at that list and say, oh, yeah, no, I do that. I didn't realize that I was actually doing that to myself. And then this is the final, almost the final slide, because there's a reference slide. But this is a quote by John Cotter, and I agree with this. I also have one to add, which is about the definition of leadership that I use quite a lot. And the word leadership actually comes from an old Anglo-Saxon word, which is leidan, and that means to show the way. And I think that sort of ties in with John Cotter's quote here. It's the one that I always like to use when people say to me, what is leadership? But it's very pertinent to the idea of taking the initiative, because it is literally just about showing people where those opportunities are. And I think that's a very concise way of talking about it. But it also shows how taking the initiative is absolutely key part of leadership. So here are also the references if you want to take a look at those and write any of them down. They're also down, if you go onto the Institute of Leadership and Management website and look at taking initiative, drill down through that model, the references are there, and there's also a little bit more in the report about taking the initiative. So I hope that's been very useful, and I'm happy to take some questions now. Thank you very much.
Matt, many thanks. Yeah, I think very useful. We've got a few questions. Maybe I could start off with a sort of personal one, because I think it was very powerful when you said, coming from the Navy, you found it was quite a different working environment. I wonder if you've got any other sort of tips or advice from, because we have quite a lot of people in the ILM who have come from a sort of military background or a more hierarchical. If you've got any sort of advice for them around boosting their confidence, taking the initiative when they're working in a completely different sort of environment.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nicholas. Yeah, that's good, because I like to talk about that, actually. So, so I think for people who are leaving the armed forces, I think the key thing is that people in the armed forces have a whole bunch of skills which even they don't know about. So, and I could talk about that for quite a long time, but that would just burn up all our time. But teamwork is a key one, working in teams. Agility, which is something that's not often associated with the armed forces. Also information security skills, because they come from an information background. So part of it might be do a little bit of research and find out what people from the armed forces are actually good at, because a lot of employers don't know this either. So it's not something that they're going to know about unless you bring it up. So that's a key one. Another one is just the level of investment and training in the armed forces means that in leadership terms, certainly, you're a very good prospect for any employer. The leadership training that you get is second to none. Then I think there's all the issues about disorientation and how you get around that. And that's actually very difficult. I have to say, most people in the armed forces do get good jobs, and it's not so much that, it's just the pain of the transition process and that disorientation when you suddenly find that you are the only person who's responsible for something, and it's down to you, and you don't back check with somebody else. You're not working necessarily as a team, or certainly not as strong a team. So that's very disorienting. So it's just sort of developing that self-belief and those habits. And I think, as I said in the talk, just starting to do, I think it's one of these things where you feel the fear and do it anyway. So for me, talking about leadership, even though I've done leadership for 30 years and I've studied it at a really high level, standing in front of a group and having that imposter syndrome where you sort of think, am I really qualified to tell these people about leadership? It's really hard, but I think you just have to do it anyway. And then once you've got them under your belt, then, it's the same, I think, for project management, for example. A lot of people in the armed forces are very good at project management, but they maybe don't have the qualifications. But it's just getting out there and doing it and showing people just how good you are. And once you've got a few under your belt, it gets easier after that.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting that this is about taking the initiative, and you seem to be saying, actually, you need to build this into your day-to-day practice. You'd imagine taking the initiative is just quick decision, but I think what you were saying is actually you need to have the right mindset and the planning and the thinking behind it, so that it looks like you've taken a quick decision, but actually there's a lot behind it in your day-to-day practice. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. Actually, there was a webinar a few weeks ago about innovation, and that was very, very similar. They were talking about processes to create innovation, and you might think, well, hang on, innovation, surely that's a spark of the moment, creative sort of thing. But I agree that there is a sort of framework behind it, and I think it's better. Some people can just make quick decisions, but if you make quick decisions, they're not always going to be the right decisions. So I think that having that framework behind it, literally spending 5 minutes a day to look at the various opportunities until it builds into a habit, I think you'll find that all of the successful leaders are generally people who are constantly thinking about new ways. If you look at, Jeff Bezos or something like that, he's constantly innovating. He's always thinking. But I don't think he sort of went into his office one day and said, right, let's build a spaceship. I think he was probably thinking about that for a considerable amount of time before that started to roll.
A couple of questions around if you're in an organization that isn't very sort of initiative friendly, as it were, how do you change that? I think related to that is, how do you sell? You want to take more initiative. How do you sell that to your manager? How do you sell that to your senior leadership?
Well, that's really hard, and I've been in that situation myself. I'm sure lots of people have. It is very difficult. I had a boss once who just I'd discovered something. I like to do some research. I discovered something about the way we were doing training that I felt we could do better. I presented him with the data, and he just wasn't even interested. So you have to say, well, I've lost that battle, but the war is still ongoing. So I just kept trying to influence him. Not nag him, but just sort of keep coming back every time there was an issue. I would say, well, look, this is what the data is saying. Maybe we should have a look at this. And eventually we did, and we changed it, and we improved it. And that guy was also a great boss, but it just wasn't particularly into the idea of innovation, or perhaps he felt that if there were going to be any new ideas, they had to come from him, which is quite a common thing. I went on a sort of a team away day with a group of civil servants about 20 years ago, and the boss that we went away with had a lot of problems with the exercises we were doing, where a lot of the best ideas were coming from some of the lowest paid people in our group, and he was really struggling. He was sort of competing with them to try and have new ideas. So this sort of thing does happen, where you might have somebody who feels they're responsible for innovation and decision making and taking the initiative. And I think it comes down to that confidence and that assertion again, that you just have to keep plugging away, not taking it personally, but just keep plugging away and finding new ways to make your case. Unfortunately, that's sort of, they talk about intrapreneurs is a good example of people who work within a big organization who are trying to find new ways and improve ways of working.
Maybe just to turn that round the other way. Because you also talked about encouraging this sort of approach in your team. If I'm a manager of a team or a leader of a team, what if you have a team of people who aren't that, they're not used to it, and you're saying to them, come on, everyone, I want you to take the initiative, but actually they're not doing that.
I think, that's very difficult as well. But what that was actually included, I think, in the slides there, where this sort of business of trying to be a good role model. It's one of these things you can't just turn around towards a team. It's all about psychological safety. It's no good sort of bawling at people and telling them to be more creative. That doesn't work. That sort of very toxic sort of environment actually shuts down creativity. So you have to build that framework for them. Everyone is different. Some people will be more willing to take those opportunities, so you just provide them with those opportunities and hope and wait that they will just sort of see them and take them. You might give them a little bit of a nudge. As I say, it might be more of a scaffold approach where you build them up slowly with fairly small projects, small decisions, and reward them when they get it right. And just build them up. It's all about, that's sort of a question really about changing culture. And there's a lot of writing about that. But personally, I ascribe to the view that a culture tends to have its own sort of codes, its way of doing things. And if you try and attack that code directly, you get a lot of resistance, and it's a lot harder work. So it's much better to work with people, a bit of management by walking around, get to know people, what are their issues, and sort of coax them along gently and give them the opportunities. Some people just will probably never take the initiative nor want to take the initiative, but that doesn't mean that they're not valuable members of the team.
Just you talked a bit about De Bono's, the thinking hats and the different perspectives. And I know you've got a lot of experience in the sort of maybe the academic side of management.
Yeah.
Is there something here where this can all seem very artificial? If you try and put this into an organization and you say to everybody, okay, you wear these hats, or here's a whiteboard, we write on our whiteboard, people just think, well, okay, this looks quite fun, but it doesn't really have anything to do with our our practical organization. How do you use that sort of academic theory or these models and actually get people on the ground in your organization to use them?
Yeah, that is again quite tricky. But I think, again, this is another habit thing, a habit forming thing, that if you do get people together. I mean, generally speaking, I think people quite like the idea of leaving their day-to-day work to go and think about a problem together or socially. It's a break up from the normal routine. So it's not normally difficult to get people into a room. But what they might think is, well, this is half an hour, 40 minutes, or maybe it's a day of me not being at work, and that's fine. I don't really want to think about work, and I'm very against this sort of thing. But I think you just have to you have to break the ice, break people down into small groups, get them doing it. And again, it's a habit forming thing. I think, the thinking hats thing, I think was sort of written to try and get over that barrier, because it's not that academic in its out. It's a way of breaking up an academic idea about parallel processing and psychology and so on into just a usable thing. Let's think about 6 hats, and just, write stuff on a whiteboard. And also I think because it includes people, I've had this a few times where you get people into a room and, the old MBA way of doing it, writing everything down on a Post-it note and all of that sort of thing. And I think they quite like the fact that they've been asked and not just been given a directive from upon high. So yeah, that cynicism is always going to be there. And, it's a particular problem, this sort of bridging the academic, practical barrier, but the guys in the room are probably the best people to do that. They might say, well, I see where you're going with these hats, but hey, what about this? Why don't we try this? And maybe you can leave the hats behind and go in a different direction, which is more suitable.
Matt, I'm afraid we're out of time. Thanks for your presentation and for answering our questions.